Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. What a lovely crowd. Thank you all for being here on a sunny and still cold February afternoon at the University of Vermont in Memorial Lounge. It looks like we have a mix of students who might be either in the Gender Studies Department or in Professor Kornbluh's class. Yes. Before I expound on who all of you are, I am Keisha Ram. I am a former state legislator for this district and was a university trustee at University of Vermont until 2017. I consider both of the women next to me mentors and friends and co-conspirators, in some case grandmothers, and just people who have shaped me. So I'm honored to be here to help facilitate this. And it's great to have such a wonderful group of people. It's an age-diverse crowd, and I think that's incredibly appropriate for the diversity of topics we're going to cover in this book talk. Maybe some of you have seen copies of the book or have copies of the book or have even read the books already. I'm partway through Governor Kunin's book. And I've been hearing a lot about Professor Kornbluh's book because we're both on the Planned Parenthood of Northern New England board together, and it's really applicable to our work. But they are also very different books, right? So, you have a historical, academic, deep dive into a feminist critique of social policy in this country and how it has or has not served women and children particularly. And you have a very intimate and personal look at something that many women and feminists struggle with in the process of aging, and in aging with compassion and for oneself in a lot of ways. I've been fortunate to hear some of Governor Kunin's book talks already on this book, and if you have not, you're in for a treat with both of these lovely and poignant feminist thinkers. So without further ado, the format of this evening event is I'm going to introduce each author, and they will speak for about 20 minutes. It can be excerpts from their book. I'm, along with you all, an audience waiting to see how this unfolds. And we will let both of them share some thoughts on their bodies of work, and then we will take questions after that. So thank you all again for being with us. And I am going to carry my little microphone to the podium to introduce both of them. Okay. Dr. Felicia Kornbluh is Associate Professor of History and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at UVM. She is the author, with Gwendolyn Mink, of the recently published book, Ensuring Poverty: Welfare Reform in Feminist Perspective. She is also the author of The Battle for Welfare Rights: Poverty and Politics in Modern America, and has written many articles for academic and non-academic journals. She is a member of the Board of Directors of Planned Parenthood of Northern New England and a former member of the Vermont Commission on Women. Kornbluh has been an advocate for women's and children's well-being for many years. She was a staff member of the U.S. House Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, and of the Washington, D.C.-based think tanks, the Urban Institute and Institute for Policy Studies. She led the children's advocacy organization Children's Express while in high school and reported from Japan, Cambodia, and the Soviet Union, as well as from the 1980 and 1984 national political conventions. See, I like reading the whole bio because I didn't even know that about you, so that's really exciting. From 1995 to 2005, she participated actively in the Women's Committee of 100, a group of feminist scholars and writers organized under the slogan, "A war against poor women is a war against all women." Before I bring Dr. Kornbluh up here, I just want to personally say it's been a joy and a privilege to serve alongside her on the Planned Parenthood Board of Northern New England because she brings such an unapologetic and fierce feminist perspective and reminds all of us that reproductive justice is really different looking than even what we try to do at Planned Parenthood in creating reproductive access. And we have a long way to go in creating social policy that really feels safe and welcoming for particularly every woman in the United States. So thank you for your work, Dr. Kornbluh, and I'd love to invite you up here to share your book.
Okay, thank you. What's the point?
How's my sound? Are we good? I see a lot of nodding. Okay, good. So first of all, I want to say that I'm delighted to be with these two women. One thing that we have in common is that all of us have been involved in the organization Emerge Vermont, an organization that trains Democratic women to run for political office. And Governor Kunin founded the Emerge chapter in Vermont, and Keisha Ram has served on the board and has been very active in sustaining that organization. I was just a student. I took the Emerge Vermont training, and what I learned at the end of the training was that I was not well suited to run for political office. So I love and revere the people who are willing to run and who take that as part of their life's work. I am always thrilled to support them, even though I think that's probably not my way to go. Okay. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book and then also extrapolate a little bit from some of the main themes. In a study published in February 2015, researchers found that the 1996 welfare reform law shortens women's lives. Scholars studying just 2 states compared the old pre-welfare reform program with the later one and discovered that the policy that was authorized by the landmark statute called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, or as I will call it, the PRWORA, it shortens recipients' lives by nearly 6 months, while saving governments approximately $28,000 per recipient over her lifetime. An earlier study had found that in Florida alone, the death rate for participants in the post-1996 welfare program was 16% higher than for people who had received welfare in earlier decades. And this little bit of data was really the starting point for writing this book. I had been doing research in this area for many years, but when these data came out, and they were a momentary blip in the national media, it was just at exactly the same moment when Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State of the United States, was being called before Congress over and over and over again to talk about what happened in Benghazi and what went wrong. And she was, once again being asked to dissect a series of decisions that were made. And I don't know, maybe something went wrong in Benghazi, but I was enormously struck by the contrast between these two things. The huge amount of media and political attention that was lavished on the Benghazi incident versus basically zero attention that was paid to what seemed to me like good, solid, peer-reviewed research that was indicating that American public policy may be shortening women's lives. So this book, Ensuring Poverty, which I co-authored with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink, is an effort to explain how we, as a nation, may have ended up with public policy that promotes the early death of low-income mothers. In writing the book, Mink and I tried to explore this law's impact and also consider why so far it's been so stubbornly resistant to change. The book chronicles the contested history of welfare reform, including often forgotten alternative arguments that were made by feminists and proposals that would have helped mothers achieve independence for themselves and economic security for their families. We assess public policy debates in this area of welfare reform that has very often been treated as one of consensus. So we argue that there was no consensus in the middle 1990s, that especially among Democrats and among feminists, there was enormous debate around this issue, and that it's very important for us to retain that sense of debate, in a sense, a usable past for people who may want to make different social policies today. We argue that the origins of this 1996 welfare reform and the failure of politicians to repeal or transform it has to be understood in terms of gender. And when we talk about gender, we mean it in the way our colleagues in the Feminist Academy mean it. Gender that encompasses devastating stereotypes about men as well as about women and about femininity. Gender as an archetype of binary roles that doesn't acknowledge more than 2 options and really has little to do with the way many people live today. Gender as experienced by manifestly heterogeneous, real people at the power-clogged intersections to which legal scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw has called our attention almost 30 years ago when she coined the term intersectionality, and especially at the intersection known as what our colleague Eileen Boris calls racialized gender. In fact, welfare reform represents an ideal case study for scholars of intersectional gender and public policy because just looking at it from a left-right perspective doesn't capture fully what went wrong in the life of this policy. We have many colleagues like the sociologist Louise Waquant at Berkeley and many others who have argued that this welfare reform was part of what they call neoliberal politics. They say that the welfare reform of the 90s was part of accommodating a low-wage labor force in America, and that was essentially its purpose. We argue, by contrast, that an economic argument doesn't capture everything that happened in this law, either in the 1990s or since then. The law has a persistent emphasis on stereotyped norms of sexual, romantic, and parental behavior, and only a really robust theory of intersectional gender, racialized gender, we say, can explain the central place of these norms in this area of public policy. And also, I think we would need this kind of theory of gender if we're going to understand why this policy has lasted so long, and why even some progressive Democrats, like Barack Obama, would have essentially acquiesced in the continuation of this policy. So we have three goals in the work. First, we want to bring an understanding of this kind of intersectional feminist politics, what we sometimes call in the book intersectional sexism, to the study of American public policy. And we want to affect, if we can, both what's happening inside universities and what's happening outside universities. Second, we want to encourage, especially our colleagues in the Feminist Academy, people in gender studies and sexuality studies, to take seriously the study of public policy, which is something we don't always do. And third, Gwendolyn Mink and I hope that our work will broaden the way broad publics in America talk about the safety net and poverty and issues like welfare, justice, and indeed about the history and the future of all public policy in the United States. So in case it's not obvious, I'll underline the fact that this is not a neutral treatment of public policy history, although in my view it is an honest one. And I think this is where the title of our session tonight, which we called Feminist Journeys, the Personal and the Political, that's where this comes up for me. Gwendolyn Mink and I are colleagues of long standing. We have done advocacy work, both of us, on social welfare for over 25 years. We met way back in 1993. Some of you probably were not alive in 1993. Time to think of it. Okay. Just getting clear about where I am. Well, we met then. I was young. I was fairly young. We were both participating in a congressional symposium on welfare reform that had been organized by Gwendolyn Mink's mother, the late Congresswoman Patsy T. Mink of Hawaii. And Patsy Mink's manuscript collection, her papers that are at the Library of Congress, are the key source that we used for the book. Gwendolyn Mink and I were both members of the Women's Committee of 100, which Keisha already mentioned. We lobbied Congress in the middle 1990s to try and stop these proposals for welfare reform from becoming law. And then we came back at the turn of the 21st century and lobbied on behalf of what we thought was a superior feminist alternative. The book then is in part a chronicle and an assessment of our own political efforts, as well as the efforts of my co-author's late mother. So this work is about my feminist journey. Oh, sorry. I won't hit that anymore. It's about my feminist journey, and it's a personal and a political as well as a scholarly exploration. And I should also say, since my students from American Jewish history are here, I'll do a brief thought on how Jewish feminism or Jewish women's feminism plays into this. I'm not really sure why, but many of us, a disproportionate number of us who participated in this effort, this Women's Committee of 100 and the writing of this alternative proposal for welfare reform were Jewish women. I counted in the formal document that we created, which we called the Immodest Proposal for Welfare Reform, at least 9 out of 15 of us were Jewish. And there may be others whose names and whose histories don't necessarily suggest that. We lobbied Congress with a group of many different feminists, but many of them were Jewish feminists, including the great Jewish feminist Betty Friedan, who joined me in lobbying the House of Representatives in 1994-95. It's something that maybe people want to talk about in the Q&A, or maybe when we're in class next week, to think about, what is it about 20th century Jewish feminism in particular that might lend itself to this kind of politics. Okay. I'm going to say a little bit more about this welfare reform and then just get to my conclusion. So this welfare reform of the 90s, just so you know what we're talking about, it really was a landmark and important law, a transformative law. It replaced an old program from the New Deal period, which had lasted for 60 years, called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, with a new program that's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. And that new program, the TANF program, the key switch, the key change was that it eliminated the idea of an entitlement. So there's no longer in America an entitlement to assistance for low-income mothers and children. And what the entitlement meant was that if you needed it and you qualified according to your own state's criteria for receiving benefits, then you could receive it for as long as you continued to qualify, right? For as long as you continued to be poor or meet whatever other criteria. That was the old days. In the new days, under the TANF program, there's a 5-year lifetime limit at the federal level for anybody to receive benefits. And the individual states were explicitly allowed to cut that down even lower than 5 years. And many have done so to 2 years, or in some cases even states provide no cash assistance. They just provide other kinds of assistance to people. Maybe that sounds okay if we also make sure that people get a job. But the program did not provide education services or training for jobs. Certainly, it didn't provide that to every person who might need it. And the law also did not provide child care to people who were going to be leaving the old welfare system for the workforce. There was some more money for child care, but it was never provided as a matter of course or as a matter of security so that parents could be sure that their kids would be in a safe place. And in addition to those time limits and work requirements, this welfare reform came with new regulations on people's reproductive and family decisions, and that's why we say we really have to understand it in terms of gender. The new pressures stigmatized and punished childbearing while poor and unmarried, and they affected fathers as well as mothers by expanding the national system of child support so that low-income men are expected to provide child support in many cases when they really can't do it, and some men even have been jailed since the passage of welfare reform because of their non-payment of child support and the interest that they're charged on the child support that they haven't been able to pay. So it's a big deal piece of legislation. It also enacted a new kind of anti-immigrant bar in American policy. It used to be that if somebody was documented, was a so-called legal immigrant, that they would be able to receive assistance on the same terms as people who were citizens. But under this law, which was signed by a Democratic president, that was no longer true. and there was a kind of a new bright line between citizens and non-citizens. One of the big questions that we're haunted by in this book is, why did the law last for so long? Why haven't we been able to change it? Even those of us who are progressives and feminists who've been very engaged in this for a long time. And I think a lot of the reason is because we've been trying to participate in a public policy arena that has been starved of some important feminist ideas. And we focus in the book on this idea of intersectionality or racialized gender, and the idea of so-called reproductive justice. And both of these ideas are trying to call our attention to the different ways that sex and gender are experienced by people with different histories and different identities. Reproductive justice in particular asks us to think about the realms of childbearing and parenting, and it really demands that feminists expand their so-called pro-choice movement to include what it would take to ensure access to the choice to parent, to have a child, as well as the choice to avoid parenting. And you know, we're in a university setting here. These ideas may be familiar to many of us, but I have to say, in my experience, the people in Washington, D.C. really don't know about this language. And even some of the people who call themselves feminists, in my experience, aren't really attuned to the ways in which we're now thinking about how feminism has to be nuanced depending on what community you're from and what your identity is. And when I was lobbying Congress in the middle 1990s, I found this all the time. And there was one time when we were just talking to women legislators, Democratic women legislators, and asking them to take what we saw as a courageous stand around this welfare reform. And time and again, we were told that people, by the representatives, that first of all, they thought it was too risky, but secondly, that they felt like they were sticking their necks out to be pro-choice and to defend Roe versus Wade, and that they really felt like we shouldn't ask them to go beyond that. So I think part of the work of the book is to say, in a way that we expect people to find a little bit challenging, you know, that feminist politics is actually urgent and critical, but we're also asking people to go beyond that. And let me just end so that we can get into the questions. We also, as people who've been trying to cross bridges between the academy and the world of public policy, we would also ask all of you to do that work as well. And I know it's hard, right? Sometimes it's hard to figure out where to plug in. It's hard to figure out how to gain access. I think we're lucky in Vermont and in northern New England in general. Our government is relatively accessible to us, and we can find ways to plug in. And I would also say that if we care about the fate of low-income women and children in particular, you know, the things that affect low-income women and children are not just happening at the national level. They're happening at the state level. They're happening at the community level, right? They may be happening at the level of an individual welfare office. They may be happening in all of the nonprofits that are across our communities. So there are many, many different ways to plug in. But I would also say that we may need to build something new, right? Those of us who were participating in welfare reform politics in the middle 1990s kind of stumbled into a very high level of engagement with public policy. And given our very limited resources, I think we did pretty well. But it's not entirely surprising that we weren't able to change conventional understandings of how the government and the labor market and the family all fit together. We didn't do that. And we didn't defeat welfare reform either. I think that bringing a nuanced feminist understanding into public policy might well be hard work. But as Representative Patsy Mink used to say, quote, "We have to build things that we want to see accomplished," unquote. Thanks.
I'm just going to get my glasses.
Thank you, Dr. Kornbluh. I was reminded of many Republican and Democratic governors in Vermont trying to limit our TANF benefits to the 5 years that are offered federally to try to access some budget cuts and reduce our Reach Up program, which has been so successful for so many women and families. And I have an image of Representative Ann Pugh in my mind, who's in the social work department here and chairwoman of Human Services, sort of on a tear through the building to the governor's office daily to make sure that didn't happen. And I just, in reflecting on this important moment in history you've captured, it did strike me. I was quite young, and there are people here who weren't alive, and to think that we would start to think of that program as the baseline and maybe depart downward or upward from there. It is recent history, in fact, and this is not the way we've always treated women and families in the country. So really appreciating what you've put together with it's Grace Mink? Gwendolyn, sorry, Gwendolyn Mink.
Okay.
She sounds lovely. They all sound amazing. So Governor Kunin asked me to shorten her introduction. Maybe she gets sick of hearing all these amazing things that she's accomplished. I'm not sure. I will say this. You know, I devoured all 3 of her other books. I think there's 3. Are there more? Okay. Especially Living a Political Life, which was incredibly helpful. If any of you are thinking of running for office, it's a formative and incredibly important book, especially for women running for office. Through all of the roles and titles that Governor Kunin has had, from journalist, mother, majority leader, governor, ambassador, undersecretary, professor, I could go on and on, grandmother, you know, I think what is reflected in all of those is being a proud feminist. You know, I think that does thread together a lot of who she is and who she's been to so many other women seeking a leadership role, uplifting them and ensuring that no one felt like they were unqualified. You know, I was back in the governor's office bringing students this week, and it's back to being all men on the walls, and I just think of the days that I missed when Governor Kunin was there bringing in every portrait of a woman that she could into the governor's office and the State House. And she's done just such tremendous work to make Vermont and the country and the world a better place. And we have to rewire our brains a little bit now to go from the policy to the personal. But I think in so many ways, you know, both of these women, and thinking about Governor Kunin's legacy, it has been to make the personal political. And that is such a gift that Governor Kunin has given all of us, that this book is an act of political courage as well, to talk so openly about aging and loss. And we're tremendously honored and lucky to have you here, Governor. And also, I should mention, in case any of you have to go, I can't imagine walking out on the governor speaking, but the books are all for sale. And so, you know, I don't think the authors will be too disturbed if you go and buy a book on your way out. And without further ado, I would like to welcome up Governor Kunin.
Thank you. Thank you, Keisha. I met Keisha when she was president of the student body at UVM, and she tells the story now too. We both tell the same story. She was wearing flip-flops and jeans, and she was a student, and she was a student leader, and we had a great conversation. And then about a year or 2 later, I met her at the State House when she was elected, and she was wearing heels and a suit and a short haircut. She transformed herself into a very excellent public policy person. And I find it interesting, Felicia, that you ended your talk with encouraging the public policy people to enter the political world, and not necessarily running for office, but knowing what's happening and having influence on legislation as it is being developed. And I always thought there should be a closer relationship between academia and politics. And so a lot of you are probably inspired to make change in the world, and this is a time when we welcome that. I'm putting it most subtly. But it's an important segue, and just because you don't want to run for office, that doesn't mean you can't have an impact. Well, I'm at the other end of that spectrum. I mean, I'm not really leaving politics because part of my role is mentoring people. And of course, I listened all day yesterday, so I'm hooked still on what's happening. But I'm in a different phase of my life where I'm more introspective and have more time to be introspective, and where I have a certain freedom. Being 85, I actually am liberated from having to be careful about what I say. You know, as a public figure, you still put things through a sieve and try to leave out what will get you into trouble or just be critical. You're very exposed. Well, at this stage of my life, I felt I could say what I was thinking, and I was thinking in a different way. I don't fully understand it yet myself, but I wrote poetry. I wrote about my feelings, about my husband died about a year ago. So this is not a political book, and I deliberately didn't want it to be a political book. I wanted to explore what was happening to me physically and intellectually, emotionally, and it doesn't cover everything, of course, but it's a new journey, to put it in that framework. And I took more risks, and I was worried about taking these risks. I was, you know, I talked about things I could never talk about as a politician, or I didn't fit into my life. As a politician, you're like those cardboard figures that you see on the streets of New York, or the candidates, or I don't think I've seen one of Trump. There may be a reason for that. But all of us are, of course, more complex than that. So I've tried to talk about the nuances, not just are you liberal or conservative, or are you a Democrat or a Republican, but what made you who you are today. So I do write about my father's suicide, which is still hard for me to say, even though it's been forever and I actually never knew him. But I could write about the things that shaped me in a different way. And I think, in a sense, I wanted to do that, though I didn't do it consciously at the moment. Well, I'll start with a poem. And, you know, you don't have to be old to like this book. Otherwise, you'll wait a long time. But no, I'm surprised how it's been received, because young people actually relate their grandmothers to it. You know, when I wrote my previous books, I spoke to a lot to college students and to young people, and people bought it for their daughters or granddaughters. Now people are buying it for their grandmothers. So it's a different trajectory. But I'm also surprised when people respond to it, men respond to it. And the things I was nervous about are probably the best things in the book. So I guess when you're somewhat vulnerable, people can relate to it. Well, this is a poem called No Longer. No longer do we make love before breakfast. No longer will I dream of seeing New Zealand or the Cape of Good Hope or bears in the wild. No longer will I say yes more than no. No longer will danger sparkle and safety look dull. No longer will I look at my body without comparison between who I was and who I have become, blaming the light for the difference. No longer can I toss my hair over my face and count 100 strokes. No longer can I do without night cream and day cream, slathering on ounce after ounce. No longer can I be comfortable sitting in my chair reading for hours without getting up to stretch my arms and legs. No longer can I walk without looking down at my feet to avoid mean cracks and malicious bumps. No longer can I skip downstairs like a girl flying without feeling a thing. No longer can I approach the precipice without swaying against my will. No longer do I think ahead of where I will be in 10 years or 20 or more. Now I think in ones or twos or threes, long enough to still hunger for the food of life. No longer do I wish for the next day or the next year to come quickly, like I did the year I turned 10. I want the days to saunter like a leisurely museum stroller who stops now and then to gaze and get closer to the canvas to see the brush strokes, and then steps back for the long view before moving on. This is a prose piece which I'll sort of skip around because it's kind of long. The Year I Turned 80 is the title. The year I turned 80, the color red invaded my palette. I bought a new red Prius, thinking it might be my last car. Last car sounds like last breath, and I wanted to go out in a blast. If I hadn't worried about the wind further destroying my hair, my ears, and my eyes, I would have gone for a convertible. I had owned my old Prius for 9 years. It was beige, and it blended silently in with the other cars in the parking lot. Sometimes it took me several panicked minutes, it had to be here somewhere, to find it in the rows of vehicles. As I pushed my cumbersome shopping cart, I hoped no one would notice that I was lost, or rather that my car was lost. My old car would be different. My red car would be different, on the alert, happily signaling to me, even from a distance. Red tempted me again when we decided on the colors of the walls and furniture fabrics at Wake Robin. We live at Wake Robin, which is a continuing care community, and they have different categories, and I'm in the independent part, where I hope to stay for a while. And the move to Wake Robin was a promising time in our lives. My husband had recently come out of a prolonged depression and had recovered from a bout of insomnia. We both agreed that the decision to move to Wake Robin had sparked his recovery. We had a plan for our old age. Our children would not be burdened when we reached that dreaded stage of dependence. If one of us died first, the other would not have to cope alone. The cottage was the most attractive in the area. We combined our furniture from both families. Right when we moved to Wake Robin, we decided we wanted a comfortable chair that would be new. Together we looked over swatches of material. I didn't want leather. Perhaps leather was a lifetime purchase. Sorry. Perhaps leather was a lifetime purchase, and we did not have a lifetime. We did not inquire about warranties. We looked through books of swatches, lots of colors and a choice of fabric. I spotted a bright red square and stopped. It leapt up at me. I asked John, could we be bold and choose red? Why not? He replied with his agreeable smile. I tried to picture the red chairs in our new living room. No question they would be bright. No question they would stand out. They would be contemporary, We would not be living in the past, surrounded by the possessions each of us had accumulated over 50 years. Our retirement home would be a sharp departure from that of the couple who had occupied it before us and had been just moved to assisted living. I'm sorry, I'm just... Together we looked at the swatches of material. Let's go for the red chairs, John and I agreed. The saleswoman was surprised, and I was pleased to see her reaction. We were not the beige, brown, or black chair couple she had expected. As the months went by waiting for the chairs to arrive, which had been specially ordered from Sweden, I began to have second thoughts. Would they work as I had anticipated, or would they be a disaster? Had we decided too quickly? Why hadn't I deliberated longer, given darker colors a chance? When the chairs arrived, shrink-wrapped in heavy plastic, the two men who unloaded them had to use a knife to release them from bondage. There they stood, two solid walls of red. "They're so big," I exclaimed. "They look different in the showroom." My husband was also dismayed. We tried placing one chair in the living room and the other in the study. Better, but not right. My stepdaughter came to fix the computer and sat in one of the chairs. "I like them, they're comfortable." "Really?" I questioned. John and I became obsessed with the red chairs. We talked about them over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I would take a look at them before going to bed, and again first thing in the morning, in case they looked any better. They didn't. "Let's stop talking about the chairs," John said, as his insomnia weakened him. "Yes, we won't talk about them anymore," I agreed, but it was hard. I called the furniture store to ask if we could return them. The owner was properly dismayed. He was polite, but he told me he hadn't ever sold a red chair before. He didn't want to displease a customer. He clearly was upset. "Keep them until Monday and then tell me what you think," he suggested. My son Adam came to dinner and my friend Veronica. The chairs looked different when someone sat in them. Their bodies blotted out much of the red. My son Adam said, "2 thumbs up. If you don't like the color, you can get slipcovers." My wife had done that with their cat scratch couch. True, but why slipcover new chairs? I looked at the chairs once more. I asked whether I could ever own them. Would I feel comfortable, or would they always jolt me, make me jumpy on edge? Why hadn't I chosen the light, neutral textures with which I'd surrounded myself in the past? Silent, relaxing colors that made the living room a calm refuge from the harsh and noisy world outside. Part of me, I realized, no longer wanted a refuge. I wanted to bring life inside, not leave it at the door. And the red chairs did exactly that. They were loud, they were vivid. Day by day, I began to see that they had precisely what I wanted, brilliance. One bright morning, my husband and I arrived at the same decision. Let's keep them. They're still there. Thank you. Thank you. This is a poem. John and I, we were both in a second marriage, and we were married about 12 years. This is called "I Love You When You Did the Dishes." I cooked, you did the dishes. Did I love you for that? I listened to the distant clattering in the kitchen while I sat in my chair reading the newspaper. We shared most tasks then, but you did the driving, and I could sit still by your side with only a rare glance in the rearview mirror to check if it was safe to pass. Now I do everything, cook and wash the pots and meet the dishwasher's greedy demands. I make the bed which you once made when we slept together. I push your wheelchair and straighten my back, not letting it sink into a stoop before its time. I feel my muscles tighten up the incline. I wish you could feel it too from your glued position. You need me now to move in any direction, up and down and around corners, without bumping into things like winter boots thrown casually on the floor. I take the lead, pulling you out of yourself and into the world I inhabit. You visit me from time to time, like you used to do when you did the dishes and the counters always needed wiping. This evening is better than this morning when you berated yourself for growing old. What can I do, you asked, pleading with yourself. I whispered, nothing. Evenings we meet on the sofa and talk about a story in the New York Times or a scene from the evening news. We are same-minded again. The world is spinning crazily out of its orbit. We shake our heads from side to side in rhythmic disbelief. I reach for your still hand, cover it with mine, and keep it there. I haven't read this poem in a while, but I'll try it out on you. It's called I Am Multiples. And just the things I wanted to be or the things we dream about being. I am multiples. The dancer's elastic poses stretch my legs high and wide. Air up, I fall on his raised hand as if nothing had happened. The opera singer sways my sucking ribs. The opera singer sways my sucking ribs. Her high octaves tremble my bones and wrinkle my throat as I spill gallons of sound all over myself. I'm on the tennis court with someone else's arm, Venus or Serena. My body obeys every quick command from head to foot. Look, just inside the line, by half an inch, the camera ascends. The cello is settled between bent legs and curved arms, leaving fingers free to run up and down in pursuit of fleeting notes that I gulp down into a thick, low sound that feels good inside. I abscond with the poet's words and claim them for my own. Or were they mine in the beginning? I mouth them with tongue and teeth and spit them in your face. The writer says what I wish to say, leading me from room to room in her house, which seems eerily familiar. She lived there once. Chisel, brush, pen, barefaced, fully awake, ready for action. Move, they say, like we did, and make a mark. I do, asking Monet, Manet, and 90-year-old Picasso to leave me a space. I am multiples, and I am none. It is late. It is done. I'm just looking at the time. This is a... how's the time?
I'm only going to stop you if you want me to, but I think we probably have time for one more poem.
Okay.
Or reading.
Well, I'll read a short one. I'll read two fairly short ones. This is something you don't want to look forward to. It's called Teeth. And just to make it clear, it's sort of a nightmare. Okay, I won't say anything else. Teeth, I spit them out like olive pits, tainted yellow and hard, uprooted from the cave of my cheek where my tongue fingers empty rooms. I contort my smile to hide the hag I have become. My tongue takes measurements in and out, back and forth. My lids seek light. I open wide, one tooth hanging on the edge of a cliff, another set in a tub of space where it may wobble and lose balance. I panic at the thought. I must bare my teeth in self-defense. I must chop my way into old age. Ah, I smile and open wide and lift my electric toothbrush off its solid base and brush and brush and brush. This will be the last poem. It's a love poem. Where we live, what happened is my husband got more needy and weaker. He was in one part of Wake Robin, and I was in another part of Wake Robin. It wasn't far apart. This is a love poem. Each night, I wheel you to your door with a kiss on your lips. I smile, my love, at you. Generously, I think. You don't know how much I love you, you say. I do, I do. We formed a ritual of waving goodbye as I retreat slowly down the hall. At first, I wave with one hand in the air, and then my arms go wild before I turn the corner, as if struck by a storm or signaling for help. We wave in tandem. You are there, and I am here. The nurses now know we wave not for them, but for one another, to have and to hold the love we swore to once and forever. Thank you. Questions, right?
Yes, I knew it was going to be hard to end that portion, and I hope you do a book on tape, because it's really wonderful to listen to.
I am.
Oh, good. Okay, you
I've
heard it here
recorded it.
first. It was tremendous, and let's give you a break and let you have some water.
No, that's fine.
So I can just open it up for questions now. We probably have about a half an hour. I have my own thoughts and questions, but you all have been sitting so quietly and patiently. Would love to hear your thoughts. And such a great audience. I mean, I'm seeing so many accomplished women and passionate women and a few good men in the audience. So please, when you ask a question, if you could introduce yourself as well, that would be really great. Also, I'm going to repeat the question for the sake of the video, because we don't have enough microphones. And if I'm not seeing you right now, please raise your hand a little higher, or I can start with the first question. Yes.
My name is Caleb Isadi. I'm a student here. What do you think is the place for personal stories in politics?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, there is a place, and of course some people really run on it. But there are also limitations. I think you have to be careful. But, you know, the coming of age story in the traditional sense is always an important story. And I think if it can connect to the voter, that's important. Now, for example, Biden, his story could work positively, it could work negatively. But the story of losing his wife and child and of his adult son, that would probably be a part of his campaign. It can't help but be. But if he only dwells on that, then you don't want to become maudlin about it. A difference from Madeleine. Sorry, I never tried that one before. Don't become maudlin? But it's a very important question. I mean, sometimes people write autobiographies. I mean, there's the political autobiography, which you'll find most of the people running for president will have one. I mean, Kamala Harris has a book out, which actually got on one bestseller list. But most of the time, they're not very good books if you still want to run again, because they're too edited and you can see through them. That's why I think you write better books when you don't run for office again. So that's a guarantee.
I have a quick thought about that too. I used to be one of the people who would say, like, as a public policy and social science kind of person, you know, that we don't want to be messing that up with, you know, with personal narrative. But you know, I've learned over the years that there's also a great advantage to really being situated in our own stories and in our own backgrounds and our own communities. And you know, I've even come to appreciate that almost universally hated word, identity politics, right? That idea, it actually comes out of the Black feminist movement of the 1970s, the idea that our identities matter in our political work. And so there's got to be something authentic about it. You know, you don't just want to be like being maudlin and you know, bringing out your sob story. But I think there's some advantage to really being genuinely situated in your own story and your community and where you come from.
I'll just add one footnote. I mean, Michelle Obama's book is wonderful, and she couldn't have written that when she was First Lady, because it is very personal, and it's a great success. But I suspect she wanted to define herself for the public in a more complete way. And, you know, becoming is the title, and it's very appropriate.
So that question had been, for the sake of those who watch the recording, in what sense is the personal story relevant in the political space? And I'll just want to, everybody's so passionate about jumping up and answering the question, but I want to make sure I repeat the question back for folks who might be listening to the recording. Yes? So that was a reflection on how the personal can be used to connect with others through what you learned or gained from that experience. Any reflections on that in terms of?
Let's take another question.
Great,
if there
okay.
is one.
Yes, in the back.
I grew up in Florida, in a pretty conservative area, and I have half of my old friends that I grew up with are the type of people that if you use the word intersectional, the conversation's over, it's shut out. It's not going to go anywhere. And the other half of my friend group can't have a conversation without using the word intersectional. And you said something interesting that I don't know if that's what your point was, but to me it just like, didn't even think of that, where you said that even in, you know, if you speak to women in legislature and Congress, and the language you use, they're not even recognizing it, or something along those lines. And I was wondering if that's a concern. Are we using language and encouraging, you know, in academia, students to start using words that, like, is there a potential for it to drive a wedge between people who didn't have the privilege of going to university and people who did? And is there a potential for sort of like a tribalism that, you know, people rejecting each other because they can't speak to each other? And if so, or if not, okay, if so, is that a concern, or is it sort of like that has to happen?
Could you repeat the
Can you paraphrase that?
Yeah. I mean, I hear a lot of inquisitive on this one. And what was your name, sorry? Jason. So Jason asked a question, including a reflection about the use of the terms intersectional, intersectionality, where some people may be turned off and feel really disconnected from the use. Yeah. Right. So, it sounds like a question for Dr. Kornbluh. Of course, the governor can weigh in as well. To what extent do we use language at our peril in being heard by a broader audience that may feel turned off by some gourmet or academic or social justice-oriented language?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question, a really great issue. Well, and you both have engaged this in a particular way, because when you're running for office, you can't be using an academic-y kind of language, and yet you have to find a way to express, what a real program for change might look like without using that language. So I think it is a serious challenge, and I think to a large degree it's on us, those of us on the academic side of the line, to do the work of translation. I really do. That if we want to be understood, if we want the things that we're passionate about from our kind of developed understandings, from our research, from the inquiry we get to have in class, if we want that to matter out there, I think it's probably on us to do that work of translation as much as we can. And at the same time, I think to insist that the concept, not the word, but that the concept be respected, right? That we all can understand that, that diverse perspectives matter, and that, that some people experience, a whole host of challenges or barriers or oppressions or whatever we call them that others of us don't experience. I'm a Jewish lesbian, and I have a certain kind of life experience from being a Jewish lesbian, but I was raised middle class, and I had a lot of other advantages. And if I don't recognize that, then I don't think I'm doing anybody any good. And I think that we can find ways to talk about that, about how situated we are, and have respect for people who have challenges that are different from ours without necessarily using the academic language. And I think that's our job.
Yeah. Governor Kunin, you went from journalist.
I think you can't be seen as an elitist. I remember when Dukakis, but I don't remember, that thin vegetable, that salad vegetable. He was talking about, Dukakis was talking about growing, what's the name?
An endive?
Endive, yes.
I do spend a lot of time with the governor.
We're saying we should grow more of our own vegetables, and that endive or endive, maybe if you say endive, it's okay. But he was haunted by that and tagged as an elitist. So, but I think it's also the responsibility of a public person to educate. And you have to even be careful about that, especially for women, because they're called, she's like a school marm, and it sometimes brings out derogatory expressions. But that doesn't mean you can't think about it. And we should be translators from the academic side to the public side, and give examples, not just use the word, but tell stories. And that's the best way. I mean, people love stories, and you can tell real life stories, and that can get the point across. I mean, I don't know how to define intersectionality, but is there a story you could tell that would tell what it means and how you use it and what the advantages and disadvantages are?
Thank you. Yes. I think obviously, again, all of these issues are interconnected. But yeah, I'm curious about how, especially in your book, you talk about those interconnections between the personal and the sort of drier aspect of the political. But yeah, great. So Scarlett's question was how we take drier policy topics, fiscal policy, tax policy that affect everyone, and still make people as passionate as they might get about things that feel more personal, like some of the identity-based issues, social policy.
Well, you might have ideas about this too, you know, from your own organizing experience, and I'm sure that both of you do. You know, I think I did work on Capitol Hill for this committee on children, youth, and families, and one of the advantages that we had there was that the family was our unit of analysis. You know, the family was our way in. And we could think about ways in which maybe that was problematic. It was sort of a conventional way of thinking about families and stuff. But I think often we can capture what some of this stuff means if we think more about what's happening, you know, in the context of our own homes, our own families, our own attempt to pay our bills, you know, and if we can, you know, if we can bring the data to that site, I think it becomes easier for people to understand. You know, we're not talking about just talking about a system in which you know, so many dollars are going to the top 1%. And although I think a lot of people are pretty enraged about that, actually, it's, you know, people are coming out to talk about that. But we're also talking about a situation in which, you know, my family is not going to be able to deduct our Vermont state taxes anymore. And we want to pay taxes in Vermont because we want Vermont to have good social services and decent schools and so on. And yet suddenly our family economy is thrown out of whack because Donald Trump needed, and the Republicans in Congress needed to find some money to give billionaires and some corporations a tax break, and so they took it away from families in the Northeast, you know, who are no longer going to be able to deduct their state and local taxes. You know, so that's one thing to do, to kind of bring it home over and over and over again, and to try and do so in a way that's not heterosexist and, you know, not racialist and stuff like that. You know, I think is complicated, but I think that's part of the work that we have to do as well. I don't know. Do you all have ideas too?
Well, campaigning, strangely enough, is very educational, at least when people actually did campaign. And I think they still do in Vermont, and some other places they do. So it's not all through social media. But I went through factories when I was campaigning. And I understood for the first time why in Vermont a lot of working people drive snowmobiles, because you're at this machine and all you do all day is pull the lever, and you may get a half-hour lunch break. So it just opened my eyes to what work really is for many Vermonters. And I could tell that story. You don't have to go into sectionality, or I'm not even pronouncing it right. But yeah, here's a guy who worked hard, and that's what an 8-hour day is like. You meet people in their homes, you meet them at country fairs. So I think then you're authentic. I mean, the hardest thing for a politician and the most important thing is to be authentic, to look like you really mean it, that you're not just putting on a show or lying or trying to act smart. And I have to add, even though I vowed here I would never run for office, and that's true, but I don't want you to think that way. I want you to still think of politics as a possibility, because especially in Vermont, it is accessible. Local offices are important. We've had a wonderful deluge of women being elected in this past election, and they're making a difference already. The woman from New York, Cortez, Alexandria,
Ocasio.
you can pronounce her full name, but you may not agree with her, but boy, right out of the box, she's producing significant legislation. So it's still a good thing, or supporting a politician, it's still a good thing. It enriches your life, it may broaden the lives of other people. You don't have to do it all your life. You don't have to run for Congress. You can run for school board and make a difference. So just because I'm bowing out, I don't want you to.
The only thing I would add, the governor was also being modest about serving as chair of appropriations, serving on the Ways and Means Committee, and I think Dr. Kornbluh would appreciate what we're seeing now is women at the table in those conversations, and it really changes the nature of those conversations. If you're talking about child care tax credits, earned income tax credits, you're not just talking about business taxes or banking and finance, but how real people live. You're changing how people relate to financial policy as well when you're at the table. So we do, to add on to the governor's point, need more women and people who are marginalized to run for office so that those issues are brought to the table and they think differently about what it means to make financial policy in the country. Other
Can we
questions?
bring it to a conclusion? Oh, there's one more question.
Yeah.
Barry, Governor Kunin, I think you were governor for 4 terms?
3.
3? And incumbents don't lose in Vermont, especially incumbent governors. What was your mindset about stepping down?
It's the first chapter of living a political life.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Well,
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's right. The question from Barry, thank you, was that governors often are able to serve as long as they would like. We have a strong incumbency. And what was going through Governor Kunin's head in stepping down after 3 terms?
well, it's a very good question, very personal one, which I am trying to boil down. I guess something in me did not want to be a politician forever. I wanted to explore other avenues of my life. After I left politics, I wrote my first book, Living a Political Life, which is also personal, not quite as personal, but I hate to dwell on the negatives because they'll discourage you, but raising money is no fun. And when you get especially large contributions, there is some expectation. Not that you'll vote differently necessarily, but when you get a bunch of emails and a large contributor is on that email list, you answer that email maybe first. You're sure to respond to the person that has been more generous. So I think the negative side of politics got to me. And that's when I wrote my first book, Living a Political Life. And the longer you stay in office, the more criticism you get. The longer you're away from office, the more praise you get. And that's really true. I mean, I could be elected Pope, I think, after all this, as memories kind of fade, but I didn't want to live that kind of life forever. It is very demanding, and I have children. I hate to say I want to pay more attention to my family, because that's such a cliche and most times not true. But I want to live a private life again in a way that I couldn't as governor. But I loved politics while I was in it. If I miss anything, it's being introduced to other people's lives. I mean, you have a slice of life that you don't get as a private citizen. And as I mentioned, the guy in the factory, you see things you don't see. I mean, we all are compartmentalized. And you meet people that actually become friends and are interesting. But I couldn't do it forever. But thank you for asking that tough question.
Well, this is a feminist book talk, so why don't we take one more question from a woman identifying person in the audience, and then we'll wrap up and let you all talk to them informally for a little bit.
Well, that puts an onus on.
Yes, it does put an onus on the women in the room to speak up.
Any question or comment? There's somebody.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Stewart, and I work at the Community College of Vermont. And just to comment, I wanted to thank you, Madeleine Kunin, for all the work you did in supporting women who are raising children on their own in the state by supporting the post-secondary education program. It's maybe copied in a couple of other states, but it's not a national movement in any shape or form, and could be, and maybe in our future. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being such a great audience.
Thank you all very much. I hope, I think I feel riveted to buy both books. I have one, I need the other. And, thank you all for joining us. I think you will have a little bit of an opportunity to stick around and talk to the authors themselves. Thanks for being such a wonderful audience. We appreciate it.
Thank you.